What is up, everybody? This is Antonio Sierra, podiatrist and running coach, coming at you today with the Maximalist Mirage. Is more cushioning better? And this is, of course, in reference to running shoes and gets at the idea that there's this idea that we think that more cushioning in our running shoes should, of course, alleviate load in our joints, decrease injury risk. Is that true? Is it not? Is it a little bit more nuanced than that? We'll get into that today. As always, if you'd like to see the written version of this lesson, as well as see intermittent updates to what all the research is saying as it becomes more available and I become aware of it, you can enroll in my course, Peaks Formula, on my website, peaksrunning.co, which I will link in the description below. This lesson will be a deep dive into the research, and if that really excites you, then awesome, you're in for a treat. And if it doesn't, then that's okay too. I will put a timestamp on the bottom below where you can jump down to the summary if you just want the meat of the meat and bones of all the content here. So with that being said, we'll get right into it. So, the Maximalist movement kind of came about in response to the minimalist shoe trend in the early 2000s, which was really big with Vibram, and really took shape with Hoka coming on the scene, I believe, around 2011. And then I think Clifton came about around 2014. And that was one of their more successful early models, which still is probably the most successful model today. And, initially these midsoles seemed obscenely large and wonky, and they really took off initially with the ultra running community and then slowly worked their way into the mainstream public. And, going back to comparing now to then, in some ways it seems like some current shoe trends are reverting back more to the mean, where they're not minimalist or maximalist, but they're a little bit more in the middle with more focus on development of better foams to optimize energy return, which is especially true in the racing shoes. And then there's some cases where it seems like the stack heights are even bigger than ever. And if you look at the Clifton 28, I believe, we're not that high with the Clifton. The Clifton 11 versus the Clifton 1, it has a stack height of 42 instead of 29. So it's actually gotten dramatically taller, which is kind of crazy. But let's go into what all the research says and why this is all relevant. So, as far as if you're a sports medicine health provider and why this matters to you, the variables that we're interested in looking at are loading rates, which is how fast the force is being applied to the musculoskeletal system, and then ground reactive forces, which is how much force the ground is pushing up against our bodies with each and every step. And the research in this area appears to be slightly mixed. So, study that was done just last year, 2025, evaluated the impact of highly cushioned shoes on different gait parameters in 12 female runners when walking versus running, and found that female runners had a decrease in peak vertical impact forces and average loading rates by 12% and 11% respectively when running in highly cushioned shoes as compared to when they were running in minimalist shoes. On the contrary, in a 2023 study evaluating the same parameters between 41 runners using soft-soled versus stiff-soled shoes, they found that there was a decrease in vertical impact forces in runners when wearing stiff soles. This finding was somewhat surprising considering a previous randomized controlled trial by the same authors in 2020, consisting of 848 runners, and that study found that those running in hard sole shoes did have a higher injury risk. This risk, however, was found to be negated when they stratified participants based on weight. So this means that heavier runners did not experience any change in injury risk when wearing highly cushioned shoes, whereas the lighter runners did. Now, I didn't quite see where the cutoff was between who was identified as a lighter runner versus a heavier runner. So maybe take that as a grain of salt. I guess you could say at a minimum that the results are kind of up in the air. So since runners had a higher injury risk in hard sole shoes despite exhibiting a decrease in vertical impact forces, they concluded that the reason that they likely had more injuries was due to other data points that they found in that 2023 study, which showed higher work and power being exhibited around the ankle and hip, which they attributed to the increased stiffness of the shoe. We also see this trend of shoes with more cushion creating more forces when landing, becoming amplified when running at faster speeds. So there's a 2018 study including 12 men running at two set speeds, 10 kilometers per hour and 14 kilometers per hour, wearing conventional running shoes in one setting, and then maximalist running shoes in another. And they found that the ground reaction forces, the impact peak, and then the average loading rates were 10% and 12% greater respectively when running at a faster speed setting using the Maximalist shoes. And these data points were greater than when running at only 10 kilometers per hour, where the ground reaction forces were increased by about 6%. So the proposed theory is that, why this is the case is, and how I conceptualize it is that, when running at faster speeds with greater cushion under your feet, the runner that's a little bit maybe more beginner, more amateur, you might say, unconsciously lands with a stiffer leg because they're not forced to subconsciously adjust their landing position in an advantageous way, since the extra cushion in their mind will take the brunt of the force when they hit the pavement, so they're just not thinking about it. Yeah. So there's a lot of data points there, several different studies I studied, So what are the take-home points from all of this stuff, So on one hand, the data doesn't always tell the full story. While some data points may seem to point in one direction that may imply a certain outcome, they also may not. Intuitively, we know that landing with less force rather than more is, of course, preferred, but injury rates by and large still within running are quite stagnant, and all runners basically are affected by them. And this is one of my great accepted realities that maybe not everybody likes, but runners get injured. And we'll do everything we can to try to mitigate that. But to some degree, it's a reality. And the approach I take with all my athletes that I coach is it's about accepting when it does happen and handling it to the greatest extent that we can. So, at the same time, running at faster speeds up to the level of a sprint is an especially taxing activity with increased injury risk the harder you run, and lessening the impact you're experiencing during that activity is important, of course. Additionally, having greater awareness of what your feet are doing and feeling when running fast is important to prevent any trips or spontaneous ankle sprains when running at top speeds. That's a little bit of a topic that we'll get into, especially when talking about shoes with more cushion and bigger stack height, when it comes to kids running in these shoes. And I'll touch on that in a little bit. Next point, we'll get into the body will absorb what the shoes don't. So what do I mean by that? So if you've ever gone on a run where you're running on the road and you feel like you're just bouncing along without any fatigue, you feel great, and then maybe you kind of hop on, for whatever reason, either a wood chip trail or you hop on grass for about half a mile, and suddenly you feel like you're just dragging through the mud, and you're having to exert more energy to produce that same kind of bounce in your stride. And the phenomenon, what's going on, was initially seen in research in about 1998 by Ferris et al. And what's happening here is that, and what they found was that the leg will become more or less stiff in response to the type of surface that it's landing on when running. And they found that when running on softer or more compliant surfaces, the leg will stiffen to compensate for the lack of recoil that the runner will usually experience when they're running on a harder surface such as road, for example. And when you're running on that surface that's a lot harder, that you can naturally just bounce off of, because of that, the leg doesn't have to stiffen at all, and it'll kind of just naturally propulse itself off the ground. And this phenomenon is basically the same that's seen when running in shoes with midsoles that are either harder or softer. When the midsole is softer like a marshmallow and you kind of feel yourself sink into it, into the ground, before pushing off, something has to do the work of the pushing, and that something is your muscles and tendons. So there was a 2024 randomized control trial evaluating gastrocnemius muscle activation in 10 forefoot strikers versus 10 rearfoot strikers. And the forefoot strikers were found to have higher calf muscle activation later in the swing phase, which reflected the lower leg stiffening as it prepares for the increased demand that it would experience at the time of foot strike. What's really fascinating is that this data has been found to translate to actual morphological changes of the tendon that are primarily being recruited over time. So there was a 2021 prospective study involving 14 male runners, having them run 2 different time trials at 3 minutes at a set speed. That's fairly fast, about 12 kilometers per hour, wearing shoes for one session, being barefoot for one session, and then being barefoot for the other session. The researchers used ultrasound to then collect measurements of several large tendons in the lower extremities, and then calculated lower limb stiffness before and after the running sessions. When running barefoot, the runners were found to have a positive correlation between lower limb stiffness and cross-sectional area of the Achilles tendon and plantar fascia. And then when they were running wearing shoes, they had a positive correlation between lower limb stiffness and cross-sectional area of the patellar tendon. So this shows that the tendons of the legs and feet will adapt to the functional demands that they're placed under, which when barefoot is, most prominently the Achilles tendon and the plantar fascia. And then when wearing shoes, commonly the patellar tendon, which in my mind was presumably due to increased prevalence of overstriding, which is, more common in amateur runners when running with shoes. And this is all relevant because if you're getting increased stiffness in the Achilles tendon brought on by increased running in shoes with soft midsoles, by running a high volume of miles on soft surfaces, or by doing speed work on soft surfaces, when that Achilles tendon or calf muscle complex is not adequately prepared for the increased load and demand, and that's what I would emphasize: when not adequately prepared, there will be an increase in injury risk. And obviously there's lots of elites that do a ton of training, especially speed work on soft surfaces, and because they progressively loaded those tendons and muscles over time to be able to take that load. That's why maybe they're not experiencing issues at any rate, maybe. So the following sequence, if you were to kind of break it down systematically how it all progresses, it would kind of look like something like this, where you have running with either a soft shoe midsole or on soft surface. This will then trigger neuromuscular system to realize it needs to increase activation, which will then increase pre-activation of the gastrocsoleus muscles as well as the Achilles tendon, and then the leg will stiffen as a result, which will then lead to greater Achilles tendon loading during each foot strike, which then could, in theory, lead to elevated injury risk under repetitive loading. With all that being said, many high-level runners, like I mentioned, will handle this just fine because they've over the years gradually progressed their load and trained in with the oversight of many good coaches, presumably. Now let's get to the topic of maximalist shoes in young runners. So again, despite the increased prevalence among mainstream daily trainers across the board from many major brands, from Brooks to ASICS to Nike, shoes with increased stack height or more cushion have, in my mind, negative consequences in developing age runners in middle and high school, and this is supported by the research, which I'll go into now. So there's a lot of research showing that shoes with thicker soles will limit the somatosensory feedback that the individual receives from their feet, which is basically if your foot is able to touch the ground, feel the ground, it receives feedback to tell it, how it should respond to different sensations based on what's feeling and different uneven disturbances in the ground. And when they're not able to receive this feedback because they have a few centimeters of foam that's separating their foot from the ground, they'll then have a decrease in postural stability, decreased ankle stability, and then a breakdown of proper gait patterns, which is really important in kids as they're trying to learn how to move. This will also lead to a decrease in intrinsic muscle strengthening. So just basically, you think of all the little small muscles in their feet, they're just not having to work as hard and they're not receiving that feedback. So there might be a little bit of atrophy. And there have been several studies that have shown an increase in cross-sectional area in different intrinsic muscles of the feet, as well as an increase in the strength of the plantar arch when transitioning from a conventional to a minimalist footwear, because you're much lower to the ground and the shoe's not doing as much of the work. The arch and the little muscles in your feet are doing more work, so they're gonna get stronger as a result. I think the goals for kids should be trying to find a shoe that runs somewhere in the middle when it comes to stack height and compliance, which again is just how hard or soft the sole is, and then helping them with basic general strength training for the lower extremities to help prepare their bodies for the demands of running, to hopefully limit injury risk regardless of the shoe they're wearing or the surface they're running on. And to kind of wrap up everything, at the end of the day, this right here is what matters the most. So there's a lot of data and information to extrapolate from research that can help you choose what shoes, in theory, to wear. But our mind doesn't quite work in theory, and we don't have an internal computer to analyze for us which shoes are allowing us to run more efficiently with higher or lower loading forces from one shoe to the next. And thankfully, we don't need to. And just maybe there's some kind of internal perception that we have for what's best for us. And there's one study that may shed some light on that theory. And that study is this 2025 study that assessed if there was any validity to what's called the comfort filter, which is this proposed theory stating that runners intuitively select shoes based on the comfort that will allow them to naturally run more efficiently, and comparing that perception of comfort with injury risk. So an analysis of a randomized controlled trial consisting of 527 runners tracked over the course of 6 months, what they found was that runners that had the highest perception of comfort in their shoes ended up having the lowest risk of injury within that group. This, on one hand, might help explain certain phenomena that are not quite understood in the research, such as like you'll see in clinic, why some people might seem to experience relief in their plantar fascia symptoms wearing highly cushioned shoes, despite the fact that there's no difference in average loading rates or peak impact forces when walking compared to wearing shoes with less cushion. At the end of the day, comfort is king, and no matter how much data I try to throw in the face of all of it, use all the information that I just provided here and that you can go through here in the written lesson to help guide your judgment in shoe selection, and ultimately let comfort be your guide. So to kind of summarize everything here into bullet points, one would be that soft sole shoes are linked to higher average loading rates and peak impact forces compared to hard sole shoes. This phenomenon is exacerbated by running speed as it increases. Despite the increase in force value seen with soft sole shoes, increased work through ankle range of motion and hip extension, as well as injury rates, have been seen in runners wearing hard sole shoes. When stratified by weight, soft sole shoes were only found to have helped limit injury risk in lighter runners. Running on softer surfaces or in shoes with a softer midsole will increase soft tissue stiffness in the lower leg to help account for the decreased compliance or give of the surface that the vertical forces are being driven into, either in your shoe or on the ground when running. This can increase injury risk to the Achilles tendon or gastrosoleus complex through repetitive loading if the falling muscles or tendons are not adequately prepared for the increased loading. Maximalist shoes can limit somatosensory feedback due to greater decrease in the contact of the foot with the ground. This can lead to intrinsic muscle weakness and a decrease in proprioception, potentially leading to instability in the foot, ankle, and pelvis. The following are important to kids as they mature physically and through the development of proper movement patterns. And lastly, those that have higher perceived comfort in their shoes tend to have lower injury risk, highlighting the importance of comfort and guiding your shoe selection over other factors. That was a lot. If you want to go through this again, maybe a little bit slower pace, as well as check out all the references that I cited, you can see all that in this lesson, which again, I have listed on my website under the Peaks formula, which you can enroll in today for free. And that is under my website, peaksrunning.co. Please drop in the comments if you have any questions or thoughts whatsoever, and I will see you again soon. Thank you.